This podcast is brought to you by WRFL, Radio Free Lexington. Find us online at wrfl.fm. Catch us on your FM radio while you're in Central Kentucky at 88.1 FM all the way to the left. Thank you for listening, and please be sure to subscribe.
Welcome to From the Woods, Kentucky. I'm Laura Lhotka, and I'm here with my co-host, Renee Williams. And today in studio, we have Dr. Mary Arthur with the UK Department of Forestry and Natural Resources, and E.J. Bunzendahl with the U.S. Forest Service, Daniel Boone National Forest. It's a pleasure to have you two in studio today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks. We're excited to talk about fire and fire ecology.
Today, as you mentioned, we're going to talk about fire ecology, but before we get into that, tell us a little bit about how you became interested in this field.
I became interested in natural resources, I think, when I was in high school, and I discovered the joy of being in the mountains. So I grew up in Colorado, and I became a backpacker in my mid to late 20s, and then I spent several years of my early 20s working for the National Outdoor Leadership School, where I led people on outdoor trips, and it convinced me that I needed to figure out how to have a profession that would let me be outside a lot.
Great. And EJ, how about you?
I came to UK and eventually found the Department of Forestry and eventually graduated in 1993. And at that time, I wasn't exactly sure where my career was going to lead until I accidentally found fire. I started working for the Nature Preserves Commission and discovered prescribed fire, and they did a lot of prescribed fire back then. And eventually discovered wildfire, and that's how I started in my career. And to me, fire, both prescribed fire and wildfire, just satisfied both the intellectual side of my brain and the need for applying strategy, as well as the physical needs of the job. That was really satisfying to me, to have both needs met at the same time in one career.
Yeah.
Okay. Dr. Arthur, can you tell our listeners what you do at UK?
I'm a professor of forest ecology, and so what that means is that I have I have multiple hats that I wear, but the key hats are that I do research in the field of forest ecology, of which fire ecology is one arm of my research program. And then I'm also a professor, so I teach students about forest ecology.
Okay. And EJ, same with you?
I am the fire management officer for the Daniel Boone National Forest with the U.S. Forest Service.
Okay. All right, so today we are talking about fire ecology. We have listeners in Kentucky, all over the U.S., and all over the world. But, a lot of people, I think, see on the news those large fires out west. Can you talk a little bit just to kind of orient people to here in Kentucky and what we're looking at here in the East, how our fires might differ from what they might see or think of when they think of wildland fires?
The fires that you might see on TV, you see a lot of what you would call crown fires. So the fire that is moving through the coniferous trees, independent from maybe fire that's on the ground. So a crown fire is fast-moving fire through the tops of the trees. We don't typically get that here in Kentucky. Our fire seasons happen in the dormant season. We're in the deciduous forest, so our leaves drop. And once the shade is gone from the forest, then the sun can dry the forest floor out very quickly and dry those leaves. And we refer to that as fuel. Mm-hmm. So once that fuel is dry, our fires move through, we'll call it surface fires. So they move across the surface of the land. And not to say that they can't be damaging as you see out west, and we can lose houses as well, but it's just a different kind of fire. Crown fire versus surface fire. The other difference, eastern fuels and western fuels, primarily is due to our decomposition rate here in our humid environment that we have.
Describe fuels a little bit. What do you mean by that?
When I say fuels, I mean...
Because you're not talking gasoline and stuff like that, so...
Right, no. All the forest well, I guess it could be.
It could be. Well, yeah, I guess.
It could be your house.
It could be, yes.
But mostly when we're talking about fuels, forest fuels, we're talking about the leaves that are on the forest floor and the sticks and the logs that are there. And sometimes the shrub layer that's there too, rhododendron and mountain laurel, that'll burn as well. But mostly the leaves and pine needles and small twigs and limbs. Mm-hmm. Our fuels decompose fairly rapidly because of our humid environment that we have here in eastern Kentucky. And out west, they do not decompose. You might have a tree that falls in more of an arid climate that will be there for years to come. And so they have a fuels buildup issue over decades, whereas a lot of times a tree that falls in our forest, if it's left unsheltered, can decompose over a matter of 8, 10, 12 years. It won't be burnable anymore after that. It'll just have broken apart and absorbed so much moisture that it's not an available fuel to burn at that point in time.
If you could describe what a prescribed fire is, what exactly is that?
Well, before we talk about prescribed fire, we should back up.
Okay.
And we should talk about why would we have
Why
a fire
would we
on
even do
purpose?
that? Right.
And so I think it's really important to talk about how it is that we know that fire belongs in our ecosystem. And so I want to back up for a minute and say we've known for more than 100 years that fire belongs in coniferous systems of all kinds. It's very, very important in lots of systems that really are fire dependent. And so we knew that for a really long time. And I think the reason that it was so easy to know it about those systems is that they are often just one dominant tree species, sometimes two dominant tree species, so that when fire is removed from those systems, the changes to the forest are much more quickly visible to the human eye. And that's quite a bit different from our ecosystems where we have lots of different tree species. When you look at a forest, you don't pick out one species in the eastern deciduous forest, you pick out 20. And so when those forests change, either in terms of the species that are there or in terms of the sizes of the species of the trees or the number of trees per area, it's a lot harder to see. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I would say for the area that we're going to talk about where we've done some research, one of the key reasons that we could see that fire belonged there was that on these sites, and it's kind of an anomaly because these sites are located in a place where white pine is endemic, but it's kind of it's an isolated population. And what happens in the absence of fire and what happened with fire suppression starting in about the 30s or 40s was that white pine came up onto these dry ridgetops and started to fill in the understory, fill in the lower levels of the canopy in a way that made those sites much darker and much less flammable. And so seeing that, the change in species composition and structure, which was easy to see because now it's a coniferous species that's evergreen, keeps its leaves all year. So suddenly when you're walking through that system in the winter, it's like, whoa, what's with this white pine? Look at all the white pine here. Mm-hmm. And so that gradual change was actually visible in a way that it's typically not in most eastern deciduous forests. So most of our eastern deciduous forests that also should have fire in them don't have that stark reminder. And so that was just something that was true of our system, and it was kind of the way we stepped into doing research there. And then I would just say that that's coupled with some really fine work done at a place called Cliff Palace Pond that the Forest Service was involved in, and two palynologists, Drs. Paul and Hazel Delcourt, who did this really important study looking at the pollen accumulation in a ridgetop. It's called a pond, but it's really just a place where the landscape held water and muck for like 9,500 years. Mm-hmm. And in that pollen record is the record of the shifting species composition. It, of course, reflects the warming up of the climate since the last glaciation. But it also shows the way that species moved across the climate and the way that fire shaped that, because you can also see charcoal in that record. Mm. And so all of these different pieces of evidence kind of coalesced, at a time when prescribed fire was increasingly being started to be used in our region. And it gave us this opportunity to realize both that fire belonged there and then to start to figure out what does it look like to add fire back in as prescribed fire, which we'll describe in a minute, in a way that can help us understand whether returning fire as prescribed fire does the same thing that past fires did.
A lot of mounting evidence too. Well, if you look for it, you go back and you look at the journals of Dr. Thomas Walker, one of the first explorers into this area. His journals reference evidence of forest fires throughout the region as he was traveling. So there's a lot of anthropogenic fire evidence, human-caused fire evidence throughout our history and prehistoric history. And then more recently, there have been more studies on doing dendrochronology and studying the tree rings of the different trees and stumps to map fire occurrences throughout history. And in fact, some of that research was done on the Daniel Boone as well. Mm-hmm. And it showed before the time period of fire suppression, which started around the late 1930s, early 1940s, the mean fire return interval was anywhere from 3 to 6 years a fire would go through that area. And now it could be, 80 years that since we've had fire. And in that 80-year interim or 100-year interim, we have totally changed what trees you see as the dominant overstory trees and what trees are in that mid-story, that mid-level of the forest. If you look, and if you know your species and know what to look for, it becomes pretty evident now.
So you said you could tell by the rings. So explain a little bit of how you can look at the rings and tell that there was a fire.
Well, you need a microscope. So you can core the trees or the stump that's left and look, each year a tree puts on a growth ring, and you can even tell if it's early growth or late growth of that year. And so you can look through the microscope and you can see the evidence of fire, a charring or a scar that is in the tree ring record of that particular tree.
It's interesting, because when we talk about prescribed fire obviously is just when a manager decides that fire has a role in this ecosystem and they intentionally start a fire there under controlled conditions. And what's funny about it is that we talk about prescribed fire like it's really precise. And the challenge is that it can be a pretty precise prescription. Certainly the conditions under which you can light a fire are quite precise, but the way the fire unfolds on the landscape is not as precise. And it's really very much about the skill of the fire manager and their ability to refine the behavior of the fire. In general, a prescribed fire is one that's obviously lit under very controlled circumstances, and generally it just burns. In our system, it just burns the surface fuels. And in fact, what our research shows is that oftentimes it's really, really just burning the leaf litter from last year. And we have these places where we had removed the litter from the previous year, and when the fire, in a square, and when the fire was lit across that landscape, that square was left unburned. In other words, the fire couldn't perceive that to be fuel. And so these are fires that are really burning light fuels, and then that grades up. So the drier those fuels are, the more those fuels can burn. And so the antecedent period since the last rainfall is super important. And so as you edge up to that, wildfire or an unplanned fire could be a really moderate fire if it were lit during a time when the fuels weren't high. It could be pretty easy to put out depending on how it got out, right? So we don't tend to pay much attention to those because they don't capture our interest because they aren't hard to put back out. But the really important unplanned wildfires are the ones that escaped fires that occur when the fuels are really, really dry. And in that case, the behavior of the fire is quite a lot more extreme. It means that it doesn't just burn the leaf litter, but now it can burn all the way through the organic layer. It could kill trees. It could even crown out. And it could be very difficult to stop. It's a gradation, and so it has to do with, it's not just the fact of whether it's prescribed or lit accidentally or unplanned. It's really about the conditions and whether they can be controlled by lighting back fires and by controlling the edges of the fire.
So how do you
feel about that explanation? I really shouldn't be the one describing it.
I feel like we call it prescribed fire a lot because it's not that much different than if you were to go to your doctor and they say, you're fairly healthy, however, I see you might need extra vitamin C. More exercise. And they're going to prescribe you a treatment to make you healthier. And that's the same thing that we have done is a forest manager has gone out to this chunk of land and said, I've looked through this area and it needs fire as a treatment. And so that's a prescription that they're writing for fire into that landscape to make it healthier.
And can you describe a little bit about the conditions that, they know what they're doing, and describe what those conditions are that they decide, okay, today is the day that conditions are good and we can set that fire.
And it starts further back than that because the Forest Service works underneath the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, and so when we're planning a new project on the landscape, then we ask the public what they think of that project, and they're allowed to comment and enter their thoughts on our projects. Once a project has been decided that it's a viable project and we'll go forward, then we'll go out and we'll figure out where the safest places are to put our control lines. And sometimes they're roads, because that's pretty easy to patrol as a nice road. Sometimes it might be a constructed hand line, which looks a whole lot like a hiking trail. We go in and we remove all the leaves and all the organic matter all the way down to mineral soil. It looks just like a trail, and there's no fuel along that boundary that the fire can spread across. Once we have our control lines in place, then the burn plan is written, and it's written under certain parameters. So we know a range of temperature under which we want to conduct this prescribed fire. We know the range of relative humidity. We know how many days since the last measurable rainfall we're willing to still light a fire. We also look for the fuel conditions, fuel moisture levels of the different layers of fuel, whether it's just the leaves or some of the larger logs. We'll want to burn only when they're between certain parameters. And then we have to also consider the smoke. So not only do we need to control where the fire is going to be, we need to control where our smoke is going to go. Smoke on a roadway is not good. Smoke headed towards a town is not good. There are a couple of places on the forest where we have like nursing home facilities close to our forest boundary. We have federal prisons that are close to our forest boundaries, so we have to only burn under wind conditions that will ensure that smoke won't drift towards those smoke-sensitive areas. So all those different parameters have to be written into the burn plan. And so then we look for a day that's going to hit within all of those different environmental parameters. And a lot of times we get crews ready, and we are ready to go to the burn unit, and the weather forecast for the day comes in, and we have to say, oh, cancel, the wind direction changed from last night's forecast. But oftentimes it's waiting till that very morning, the most up-to-date forecast that we can get from our National Weather Service partners, before we make a go, no-go decision on the burn.
And you have people standing by and crews
Absolutely.
ready?
They have to have certain qualifications to be out on the fire line with us and the prescribed fire with us. They have to have to meet certain physical fitness requirements. And the burn plan also says what is the minimum number of people you're going to have on the burn, and what does your organization look like? Do you need 2 engines standing by, or do you just need 1? Or perhaps do you need 14 people, or can you do this burn with just 6? So the burn plan prescribes that as well. And then we also have our dispatch function, so we're there over the radio to monitor where folks are and make sure if there's anything extra that they need. We always have a contingency force lined up and available in case something unpredicted and has happened, a shift in the wind that wasn't forecasted. We have a contingency force ready to respond as well.
You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky with co-hosts Renee and Laura. We'll be right back after this short break.
Welcome to Wildlife Sounds from the Forest. This is Dr. Matt Springer. I'm an Assistant Extension Professor of Wildlife Management within the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources here at University of Kentucky. I'm here to teach you a little bit about the animals that live in our forests, especially those here in Kentucky. For those of you who might just be joining us, each week we'll play a wildlife sound from our forest. Here's our sound for this week. Stay tuned. Towards the end of the show, we'll talk about this animal and why it is making that sound.
Welcome back to From the Woods, Kentucky. Let's get back to our interview. So now that you've kind of described the prescribed fire part, can you talk a little bit about the research that you're doing? I know you two partner with research at the Daniel Boone.
Sure. Me and my research group have been doing research with the Forest Service, the Daniel Boone, on fires since 1995. So when I first got to UK as a brand new assistant professor, a faculty member here told me that the Forest Service had contacted him and said, we have this white pine growing up in this understory in the Red River Gorge area of the Daniel Boone, and we're thinking that we might want to manage that with fire. And so this faculty member said, Mary, this looks like something you might be interested in as the new forest ecologist. And I said, sure. And what was interesting about this is that, like EJ said, that was really the first indicator that these sites had been absent fire for a specific amount of time. The oldest white pines on those sites were, at the time, about 60 years old, which was how long out we were from fire suppression. And so it was really a neat and tidy story in the sense that we can see the absence of fire. Let's add fire and see what happens. And the research part was pretty tidy too. So what we found was that when we burn, we killed most trees, like 95 or 98% of the trees. White pine trees, less than 20 years old. And a subsequent burn kind of further cleared out those smaller stems. And although that's not, those aren't particularly small stems, trees older than that develop a much thicker bark, and so they're more resistant. That was a fairly neat and tidy story also, because what it tells us is that in those sites where white pine is encroaching on the uplands where they don't really belong, a return interval of somewhere around every 15 years would control the white pine there. And so that was kind of a neat open and shut case, and allowed us to go, okay, well, answered that question.
Right.
But of course, in the process, and this was, you have to remember this was the mid-90s, what was revealed to us by the work that we were doing was something that was revealed to a lot of people right about the same time, which was the problematic lack of oak regeneration in the understory. And so what I would say about that is that there were lots and lots of oak seedlings in the understory, and absolutely no oaks, or almost no oaks, bigger than about the height of your knee, until you get all the way up to the canopy. And so we're missing all of the oaks that probably would be there in between as what we call advanced regeneration. So those are just trees that are underneath the canopy that can't grow up big and tall yet because they don't have enough light. But when a canopy gap occurs, when a tree falls down or multiple trees fall down, they can grow into that gap, and that forms this ongoing stream of trees into the overstory. And so what we could see, and it coincided with researchers in Ohio, was that there was a problem for oak regeneration, and somebody along the way called it the oak bottleneck. And so we kind of shifted gears and used this really good experimental design that we had worked out with the Forest Service. So we had really good replication on the landscape, and we just kind of converted the study that we had already started to then start to look more in a more focused way at oak regeneration in response to prescribed fire. And so then that study grew up. In the interim, we started another study on a slightly different landscape, one with a lot more topographic variability, so a lot more moving parts. And that one also was focused on oak. And so through time, these are now actually really valuable research sites. I'm really proud of the work that we've done here. I'm just going to say a shout out here, because I think that our partnership with the Daniel Boone and research has been really remarkable and, probably not unique, but maybe close. And it's really the strength of the Daniel Boone managers and their commitment to fire and their ongoing commitment to our working relationship and my ongoing interest in fire and willingness to continue these projects through thick and thin when it comes to funding, that we've been able to build these long-term projects on the ground. And so now they're really valuable because it's rare to have prescribed fire projects with replication on the landscape for over 20 years. And it's given us this fantastic opportunity to ask kind of a second question. And so that second question, one of the things we know about oak is that it's not fire by itself that helps oak. It's not like no tree species thrives when burned directly. Right? It's not about that. It's about what is it that fire does on the landscape that makes it better for this particular species to be able to grow, to complete its life cycle. So what I mean by that is, what is it about fire that makes it better for oaks to be able to flower and make acorns and have those acorns fall on the forest floor and have the conditions on the forest floor be such that they can germinate and establish those seedlings, and that those seedlings can live, and that they can get enough light, that they can grow up enough so that they can have positive carbon balance while they wait for an overstory tree fall gap to create this capacity for them to move up. So one of the things that has to happen in that equation is that, yes, burning along the way can help because it thins out that litter layer and it opens up the canopy a little bit. But then when you do get those bigger oak seedlings that grow into saplings, when you get them on the landscape, you have to pause because they've got to get big enough that when you burn, you don't just kill them, because then you're sort of starting over again.
Right.
And so because we've had these on the landscape for a long time, and through, like I said, through the thick and thin of all the various ways that we've figured out how to fund it, we've been able to go back and do the study that looks at the fire-free interval. What happens on these stands when there isn't any fire for 10 years? So we burn several times, and then we pause, and then after that 8 to 10 years of pause, we can look again and see what we can find. And that's been really fruitful. And what we've found is that evidence of the success of this kind of management for oak is much more present on the landscape when you do give it that waiting period. And it varies a lot depending on the sites. And, well, in that sense, it's not quite like a prescription. It's not quite like, here, if you take this medicine, your sore throat's going to go away, and then you're going to be fine. Or maybe it is like that. You could give that same medicine to 50 people, and for 45 of them, their sore throat would go away. So there's variability in the way that prescription unfolds on the landscape, because the landscape is variable. And so we've seen these responses, and we've been lucky enough to go back to them. We have a second site where we're just now going back after an 8-year hiatus. And again, seeing the successes kind of emerging from that longer term.
And I'm not sure if the listeners realize, why are we focused on oak? Why is that important? Why is oak regeneration even something that we should care about? But not only is oak a huge marketable species for lumber and for bourbon barrels, oak is one of the primary food sources for a lot of our wildlife too. And if we start just allowing this continuance of losing oak dominance, so like Mary said, in the overstory we have the oak trees, which are providing that hard mass, those acorns, for a lot of the wildlife, but then there aren't any underneath it until they're maybe just seedlings or babies. You're going to have this oak-free period that may or may never regain dominance, and that was pretty problematic for not only our timber industry, but for the whole web of wildlife that depends on the species composition that we have right now.
And I would just add to that, too. It's important for us to be thinking about the wildlife that we know eat acorns, right? But it turns out that oak forests are different from white pine, red maple forests, the ones that are growing up underneath them. And they're different in lots of ways, not just in terms of the oak acorns not being there if we don't have the oaks in the overstory, but also kind of cascading through all of the soil microbes, the soil fungi. All of those minute ecosystems that occur below ground are also shifted by the shift in species composition. And just one way to think about that is there's been some wonderful research that a couple people have conducted looking at the flammability of litters. And what we've learned from their work is that oak leaves are highly flammable. They dry down quickly, so they get more dry faster than red maple does after the same amount of drying. When they dry, they curl up. They create the possibility for air, which of course feeds fire. Maples just get soggy and flat, and so they are problematic for burning. And so when we have this shift in species composition, we're also having a shift in all of these other ecosystem attributes, including the actual future flammability of those forest systems. And then the other thing I want to say about it is, when lay people see a forest that's been burned, oftentimes they're kind of aghast. They think, "Oh my gosh, this place has been destroyed." And so I just want to make sure that listeners understand that that's kind of a very it's an understandable but very short-term response, and that forests are actually closely intertwined with this thing called disturbance. In other words, we know that forest development, forest growth, forest everything is intertwined with disturbance. And there's lots of different ways that forests get disturbed. Fire is one of those, and wind and ice and single tree falls. There's all these different ways that forests get disturbed. And those disturbances are actually really critical to the formation, development, everything about our forest systems. They're dependent on those disturbances. And the thing about fire is that because we want to use fire in a planned way, because of the fact that we don't want it to get outside of the realm where we want it to be, there's only a limited amount of the landscape that can be burned. And so I think it's important for people to understand that what we're aiming for is a diversity of community types or diversity of landscape types. We're trying to preserve, in an Aldo Leopold sort of way, we're trying to preserve all the parts. And to preserve all the parts, we've got to have pieces of the landscape that form all and each and every one of these kinds of forest communities. And that's really like a larger ecological goal that goes way beyond thinking about forests as timber or any of the sort of man-made uses, but it's just like preserving the ecology on the landscape, because we need that for our future, for whatever those future disturbances might be. We want to have a very diverse landscape of different communities out there.
Obviously, prescribed fire is a good thing. What's the difference as far as temperature and fuel, as far as one that's kind of raging and getting out of control to one that is in control? What is the difference to see what it does actually to the forest floor?
Well, your fire intensity is going to be based on your fuel dryness. And your fuel dryness is based on the weather conditions you've had leading up to the time of ignition. So if you've had 10 days since rain and dry conditions and low relative humidity, so in the fall, those beautiful blue sky days when your relative humidity is down in the 20s and your temperature is up in the 60s or 70s, and you haven't had rain for 10 days, those are sort of some high fire danger conditions that can develop. And if you have the drier the fuels, the more fire intensity that you're going to have, the hotter the fire that you will have. And you add wind to that, and it can drive your fire fast and hot. And especially then you add topography to that, and your fires burning uphill are going to burn much faster than fires burning downhill on a flat surface, a flat piece of land. Those are the differences. Of course, the difference between prescribed fire and wildfire is that we have control lines. We have people there ready to can keep it within the containment lines. And then a wildfire, we are just playing defense. We are called to an already going fire where we have to go out and first thing assure for firefighter and public safety. That's the primary issue to begin with, is make sure everybody's safe. And oftentimes in the forest, what that could equate to is not addressing the fire initially, but addressing our visitors and getting the visitors evacuated and out of the forest and out of harm's way before we can even start addressing the wildfire. So the safety is the big difference. Safety to our firefighters, safety to the public is, in my mind, the biggest difference between prescribed fire and wildfire. Fire effects, you can still have good vegetative effects from a wildfire. You can still have positive effects to the landscape from a wildfire.
But that doesn't mean we want it.
That doesn't mean we want it, because the safety trade-offs are not worth it.
And how do you contain a fire?
There are a couple of ways. We talk strategy of direct attack, which means the intensity is low enough where we can get close to it and we can be right up next to the flames, and we basically create that control line. We're raking away all the fuel, all the vegetation down to mineral soil, so when the fire gets to the place we just removed the vegetation, it will go out. There's no fuel. The fire needs fuel, heat, and oxygen to be a fire, and you move the fuel and the fire will go out. A direct attack works a lot on those lower fire danger days where you don't have a lot of wind and your fire intensity is less. When you start having wind and higher fire intensities and higher flame lengths, then we do a strategy we call indirect attack, which means we back off from the fire quite a ways and give ourselves time to put in a control line, and then we set our own fire against that control line. Smaller, lower intensity fire that's backing away from our control line towards the main fire and essentially widening our control line. Once the fire backs away from our control line, the control line might only be 18 inches, but then once the fire moves 10 more feet, well, now you've got 10 feet plus 18 inches of control line. And we'll burn out from our control lines that way.
So that fighting fire with fire phrase is
Absolutely
real.
true.
Okay.
It's absolutely true. And in the topography that we have in the Danube Boone, that's often our strategy. That we choose because of just of the variability of our topography and the safety of our crews too. A lot of times it's easier to back off a little further, maybe find an existing road or a trail. That way we're not creating more disturbance along in the woods. We can use an existing trail or existing road, or take a line down to a creek and tie into a wet line. We're going to tie into the river or the creek and use that as a control line too. I think that a lot of our fire managers, especially here in the East, recognize that those lower intensity fires have positive effects on the landscape. And so it's easier for us to say, and on public lands, it's very much easier for us to say, it's safer for our firefighters to patrol this trail, or it's safer for our firefighters to patrol this road, and go ahead and back off and maybe turn that 20-acre wildfire into a 200-acre fire, because its safety is our primary issue, and it's a little less impactful to the landscape. It's a little different on private land, because a lot of times, maybe the landowner doesn't wish to have fire on there. So sometimes it's different priorities based on ownership.
So do all trees benefit from fire in some sort of way?
No. I think
certain kinds.
Well, I wouldn't even put it at trees. I would put it at do all trees benefit? No, I mean, we're using fire to kill specific trees that are more susceptible to fire than the trees we're trying to maintain. But I don't think of it that much on a tree basis. I think of it more on an ecosystem basis. And so really what fire is doing, everybody knows the word succession, so it's just this idea that after a disturbance in a forested system, a forest will redevelop. And through time, in the absence of disturbance, it develops, and it becomes a mature forest, and maybe it even becomes an old-growth forest. What fire is doing is it's basically setting back succession over and over and over again. Not because there's anything wrong with succession, but just because some ecosystems are well adapted to having that disturbance come along periodically. And so we're really just not letting those forests succeed to whatever would come next. In our ecosystem, it turns out to be white pine and red maple. And it's not that there's anything the matter with those trees, but we want to preserve a diversity of ecosystem types, and we know that those species were not prevalent on those ridgetops 100 years ago, 300 years ago, 1,000 years ago. And so if we're going to keep all the parts, we've got to keep systems that have fire in them and are dominated by oak.
And I think, too, it depends on where you are on that landscape. So think vertically and by elevation, too. Are you down closer to the creek? Then you're going to be more in a more mesic area where things are more naturally damp and moist, and maybe they're the shady, or the rhododendron are down there, and they maintain that moisture regime underneath those evergreen leaves so that it stays more mesic and more moist in that area. And as you climb up the slope to the ridge top, you get drier and drier and drier, and when you get on that drier ridge where the soils are thinner and the species that are there have grown up with fire, then that's kind of where fire has its place. And that's how we do a lot of our prescribed burns, as well as we realize fire doesn't necessarily have a big role to play down in those lower bottoms, in that more mesic zone, where you get some mixed mesophytic species that are growing there. It has a place on a lot of the ridge tops, though, maintaining that dry xeric environment for the trees that like that environment. And not just the trees and the vegetation, but there are a lot of wildlife species and a lot of tropical migratory birds that like a little bit more open space, or a grassy, the Bachman's sparrow, like an upland grassy area. And if you don't have fire, you're not going to get an upland grassy area. You're going to get a closed, dark, mature forest.
You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky with co-hosts Renee and Laura. We'll be right back after this short break.
Welcome back to From the Woods, Kentucky. Let's get back to our interview. So how are the findings? I mean, I know you've been doing the research for over 20 years. How do you integrate those into the practice, in the ground?
Looking back at some of the first research that University of Kentucky and Dr. Mary Arthur did with the Daniel Boone National Forest, that got integrated pretty quickly into what it is called the Forest Plan. It's our natural resources and land management plan. And on the National Forest, the Forest Plan is what guides all of our projects, what guides all of our actions, and it's kind of our reference guide to how to manage the land. What are you going to do on the forest that you are maintaining for our publics? It's very soon after the research with white pine and the findings that periodic fire could keep white pine from encroaching those drier ridgetop areas, that got integrated into our forest plan. And that's one of our kind of objectives, is to reintroduce fire onto the landscape and reduce white pine in an upland ecosystem.
Yeah, and I would say, too, we've partnered a lot on sort of the larger discussions. So the Daniel Boone hosted, and we worked together on the sort of a large regional scale meeting where we helped to integrate our findings, but also the findings of nearby researchers into this understanding of what fire was doing. And then there's now a Fire and Oaks conference that's been held probably 6 times, and the very first one was at EKU in Richmond, sponsored by the Daniel Boone, and I was on the steering committee, and several other people were, and we created this conference in response to the need for more information to be continually coming out about the role of fire with oaks. So that's really something that the Daniel Boone has led the way on, that's come about as a result of this partnership that we have, which I think is one of the many really powerful things about it. I think it's really a great example of how managers and researchers were able to work together to further our understanding in a way that's been quite pragmatic and far-reaching.
Some of the other ways that the research has fueled our knowledge, we have an effort called the Fire Learning Network. It's an initiative. It's in a partnership with the Nature Conservancy. And here in Kentucky, we have the Cumberland River Fire Learning Network, which is on the south end of the forest. We have participants in our Fire Learning Network from almost every land agency in Kentucky, land management agency in Kentucky. And we meet and we discuss what we're learning about fire and how to apply that into our practices and how to incorporate some of our new findings into our new projects, into future projects. So that's been a real benefit too. And Mary's been on the Fire Learning Network and been there with several of the meetings to help inform that group. You know, one of the reasons why it's so important for us to include prescribed fire in projects across the Daniel Boone National Forest. And as it's been said before, we're not burning everything. You know, the Daniel Boone occupies only 708,000 acres of land in eastern Kentucky. And you know, we average about 10,000 acres of fire of burning a year, and that's a very small percentage. We're trying to increase what we do each year, but it's there's a lot of planning to it, as you've heard before, and there's a lot of reliance on the forecast and reliance on the weather. We can't burn if we don't get the window to burn, if we don't have the weather that will allow us to burn within all of our parameters. The reason it's important for us to increase our prescribed fire is the term that I'm going to use is mesification, and we've talked a little bit about some of those species that are normally more mesic species, the red maple and the white pine, are starting to move up and occupy those upland areas and those ridges that are normally high, dry, xeric ridges. And as they move up, they're making it better for themselves. The white pine creates a shade layer that prohibits fire movement. The red maple will create an environment where if you have a lot of red maple leaves on the ground, that is a little bit of a prohibitive of fire movement across that fuel type. And you want to talk a little bit about how the different trees shed water?
Yep. So the tree morphology differs too. So red maple directs, when there's a rainstorm, most of the water is directed down the stem through something we call stem flow and straight to the roots. Whereas in oaks, it fans out. The structure of the canopy is different, and so much more of the water goes out laterally around, like straight through the canopy instead of down the stem in something we call throughfall. And so what that means is that we think is that the red maple are actually maybe even sort of protecting their own flammability by keeping moisture around them, but also making those sites more moist for them. And that was work that was conducted by a former PhD student in my lab, Dr. Heather Alexander. So these are all processes that make the site wetter where you have red maple. And the problem is the more red maple you have and the more white pine you have, the more the window is closing for us to be able to use fire in these ecosystems. And so there's a bit of urgency to thinking about how much fire we can get on the landscape, because wherever we don't get it on the landscape, in the next couple of decades it might be quite a bit harder to do it.
Okay. Well, you both have given us a lot of great information on fire that I know I didn't know about. We appreciate that. So what would be one or two takeaway items that you would want to let listeners know about?
Well, for me, I want folks to realize that there is a role for fire in our ecosystem. It's a very important role. However, it needs to be a role that's managed under managed and controlled circumstances. And not everybody can just go out and manage a fire, so it takes trained, qualified professionals to implement prescribed fire. And wildfire, even though I have said and we have witnessed, can have some positive effects on the vegetation and on the landscape, wildfire is very dangerous. And so people need to be very careful when they're having a campfire, when they're doing any kind of debris burning. They need to make sure they've watched the weather, they know what the weather conditions are, and they put it out completely and never leave it unattended.
Yeah, I guess I would just, since we're in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources, and so one of the things we do here is teach students, I'd just like to make the point that there's a real role for understanding forest ecosystems broadly, but also specifically in the context of forest ecology, and even more specifically in the context of fire ecology. And so I just really encourage any young people who are out there who are really interested in forests and studying forests to think about fire management, fire ecology as a pathway that might be really interesting to pursue. There's always a need for more people who are knowledgeable about how to manage fire on the landscape, and that is a skill set that can sometimes be hard to find enough of in terms of people who can use fire as a really precise tool on the landscape.
Well, thank you both for joining us today. And if you'd like more information on what you heard on today's segment of the show, visit our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org. Stay tuned for Wildlife Sounds from the Forest.
Welcome to Wildlife Sounds from the Forest. This week we have a guest with us to talk about the sound we heard earlier. Today we have Lori Thomas, Extension Forester within the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources, and she's going to tell us all about this sound that you hear now.
All right, now that sounds like a bird. Yes. I might be right on that aspect, but I don't know anything else.
Yes, you are correct. That is a bird. Isn't that a great, really wonderful song? And it's one of the birds. It's actually what it's called is a white-throated sparrow. It's one of our many sparrows that we have, and it's a great introduction into learning bird songs, bird calls, because it is kind of unique. A lot of people think you may not have heard it quite there, but I know when I'm out in the woods, I have definitely heard. It sounds like, oh, sweet Canada, Canada, Canada. Or even some say it sounds like, oh, Sam Peabody, Peabody, Peabody. It's kind of that repetitive, and it's a high, thin whistle. So it's a really good one to start tuning your ears into listening to birds. So,
so can I hear this bird now?
Yes, you can actually. This bird will sing in the winter as well in the spring and the summer and also. So you could hear it if you're out in the woods right now. So take a little walk, maybe head out to Raven Run, or even in your backyard possibly, or McConnell Springs, and see if you can't hear one of these wonderful little birds.
Okay, so we've heard it. Now, what should I be looking for?
Okay, good.
What do they look like?
It's a sparrow, and it's a plump sparrow. So, sparrows are relatively small birds, and mostly you'll see it on the ground a lot of times, foraging around on the ground. It's going to be kind of brown on top, mottled brown on the top with a gray underbelly. Its breast will be gray. But what's really going to stick out for you is it's got a black and white striped head. So it does. It stands out. And then they'll also have close to the bill little yellow markings close to its bill. So you'll see the black and white striped head and the yellow markings close to the the bill. And then the unique one is it has a white throat.
Hence the name, right?
Yes, hence the name, the white-throated sparrow. And you will also sometimes see there's kind of a tan striped version of it too, but it's it's just a tan black and white stripe on the head. So yeah, it's a pretty easy one to pick up.
Where do I find this bird? Where do I go looking for it?
Okay, so you can see this bird at the edge of the woods. You know, it likes to be somewhere where it's going to forage on the ground. So along the edge of the woods, the grounds and brushy areas. You can also see it at your feeder. They readily visit our feeders. They'll usually be on the ground picking at the seeds and stuff that have fallen out of your feeder. So look for them. And if you have feeders out, you know, be looking for it. They do like millet and sunflower seeds are two of the types of seeds that they feed on. If you want to help attract them to your backyard, make a little brush pile for them because they want some place that they can go for cover while they go collect a seed and then go back and eat that seed and cover it and then come back out and get it. So it'd be a good way to attract one of these really wonderful songbirds to your backyard.
All right, great. Well, thanks for coming in and talking about birds.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. If you'd like more information on what you've heard on this segment of today's show, visit our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org.
Hey there. If you're enjoying this podcast from WRFL Lexington, you may enjoy our live radio stream at WRFL.FM and, of course, via radio at 88.1 FM in the Central Kentucky area. We have a wide variety of programs you're sure to enjoy. Just go to WRFL.FM/schedule and see what programs appeal most to you. Thanks again for listening to this podcast from WRFL Lexington.